Newfoundland's history was supposed to be simple, a standard colonial arrival. But when researchers analyzed the DNA of 27 individuals, they found something that completely shocked them, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the island's ancestry. Today we're decoding the genetic evidence that reveals a much deeper, more complex story hidden in the human code. The surprise deepened with the haplogroups. Most of the sequences fell within European lineages, H, J, K, T, U, and I. Those labels may look technical, but in practice they point to separate branches of maternal ancestry, each carrying its own older journey across space and time. The pattern did not suggest uniformity. It suggested layering. Even at the first pass, the genetic map of Newfoundland was already refusing to stay simple. That mattered because islands invite tidy stories. They make people think in terms of arrival, settlement, and isolation, as if a community could be traced back to one beginning and one root. But here the mtDNA told a different story. A population that appeared from the outside to be a fairly recent colonial formation was already carrying a more intricate maternal archive. The signatures in those 27 people were not copies. They were distinct, and they were old enough to imply more than one founding line. The 2011 study published in PubMed, PMID 21326367, relied on mtDNA sequences rather than dramatic narrative to prove its point. The evidence itself was dramatic enough. Once the complete mitochondrial sequences were compared, the island no longer looked genetically shallow. It looked like a place where different ancestral threads had entered, persisted, and remained readable long after the original movements were forgotten. And that is what makes the first finding so unsettling. The DNA did not begin by confirming the familiar colonial picture. It began by complicating it. A small sample, yes, but already the kind of sample that exposes hidden structure. If 27 people all carry unique mitochondrial sequences, and those sequences cluster mainly in European haplogroups, then the question is no longer whether Newfoundland has ancestry. The question becomes how many journeys were already converging there before anyone tried to write the island into a single origin story. These results preserve the genetic traces of women whose lineages weathered migration, isolation, and survival. Somewhere in them is the memory of founders who did not arrive as one group, but as many. And once that is seen, the island stops looking like a peripheral settlement and starts looking like a crossroads with its own deep genetic memory. By the time the historical record catches up, the genetic trail has already moved on. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the modern population base traces mainly to Irish and English immigrants who arrived during the 18th and 19th centuries, and that single fact changes the shape of everything that follows. The genetic signatures are not floating in a timeless vacuum. They are rooted in a very specific period of settlement, when small groups crossed the Atlantic, founded families, and then remained tied to one another through distance, weather, and limited movement. The lineages now visible in DNA are the residue of those arrivals. A 2023 study by Gilbert et al., published in Communications Biology, PMID 37117635, makes this pattern scientifically impossible to ignore. It shows that the population of Newfoundland and Labrador went through a significant reduction roughly 10 to 15 generations ago, and that squeeze left a measurable mark: increased homozygosity. In plain terms, the gene pool became narrower, so inherited segments from shared ancestors began to appear more often in later generations. That is not a decorative detail. It is the kind of signal that explains why a community can preserve rare ancestral combinations long after the original migration wave has blurred into local memory. Seen this way, the earlier mitochondrial results stop looking like an anomaly and start reading like a fragment of a much larger demographic history. If the maternal lines were already showing a mix of European haplogroups, the population-level bottleneck gives that mixture a setting. A small number of founders arrive, their descendants stay geographically close, and over time the same surnames, marriages, and parish networks reinforce the genetic pattern. What appears at first glance to be genetic simplicity is often the opposite: a compressed record of repeated inheritance inside a constrained environment. That is why the word origin becomes misleading if it is treated as singular. The deeper source here is not one arrival, but a sequence of arrivals followed by isolation severe enough to preserve their marks. The Irish and English settlement streams of the 1700s and 1800s, formed the visible base, yet the later bottleneck sharpened the outline even more, locking in traits that might have dissolved in a more mobile population. The result is a community whose DNA carries both movement and confinement at once. And that tension matters, because once the bottleneck is recognized, Newfoundland and Labrador can no longer be explained only by who came across the water. It must also be explained by who stayed, who married nearby, who built families in small coastal enclaves, and who passed on shared ancestry in ways that became more concentrated with time. The genome is not just preserving migration, it is preserving the consequences of living at the edge of a place where leaving was costly and staying reshaped everything. So the older assumption starts to weaken. The visible colonial timeline is real, but it is not sufficient. Beneath it lies a narrower and more recent demographic squeeze that helped make the present genetic landscape what it is. And once that is understood, the next question is unavoidable. If the modern base was formed this way, what other ancestry survived in the margins, waiting for the records to catch up? At first, the shoreline seems to agree with the familiar story. A cold coast, narrow harbors, families pulled inward by weather and distance. But then the older layers begin to speak, and they do not match the simple line people were told to trust. In 2017, an interdisciplinary analysis led by Dugan et al. At Memorial University of Newfoundland, Current Biology 2017, revealed a far more complex history. Different indigenous groups occupied the island in separate periods, including the Maritime Archaic and the Beothuk. That detail changes everything, because it means the land was not holding one continuous human trace waiting for Europe to arrive. It was receiving, losing, and receiving again. The evidence does not come as a dramatic artifact pulled from a single grave. It comes from comparison, from the slow work of linking buried material to known ancestral signatures, and from noticing where the patterns refuse to collapse into one origin. The Maritime Archaic presence reaches deep into the island's past, long before the colonial frame most people start with. The Beothuk appear later, but not as a footnote. Their DNA carries a separate historical pulse, one that proves the island's human story was already layered before the written record began to harden. That is why the traditional colonial map of ancestry collapses under the weight of genetic evidence. If two distinct indigenous populations left their mark at different times, then the island cannot be read as a blank stage later filled by European settlers alone. It was already a place of transition, movement, and replacement. Some groups vanished from the visible record, others endured in traces, and the remains preserved in laboratories now expose a rhythm that history books often flattened. The surprise is not only that these people were there, it is that their separation can still be detected after so many generations, after salt air, burial conditions, and centuries of erosion. The archive survived in bone and tooth, while the names of those who carried it were nearly erased. In that sense, the DNA is doing more than identifying ancestry. It is restoring succession, showing that one community did not simply follow another in a neat line, but overlapped, shifted, and left behind an inheritance that was never fully visible at the surface. And once that is clear, the broader problem becomes harder to ignore. The island's later settlers did not arrive into emptiness, and the genetic landscape they encountered was already marked by earlier human chapters. The coast remembered more than colonization. It remembered prior occupations, older identities, and a sequence of lives that still complicate every attempt to simplify the past. At the laboratory bench, a row of tiny vials held a quieter answer than the one history had prepared. The maternal line, pulled from complete mitochondrial DNA in 27 Newfoundland individuals, did not collapse into a single signature. It split into 27 distinct sequences, yet those sequences did not point outward in every direction. They gathered inside familiar European maternal branches, H, J, K, T, U, and I. The pattern, reported in PubMed in 2011 at https://pubmed.ncbi.nlm.nih, Gov 213266367, was not a contradiction. It was a correction. For years, the easiest story was that one wave of settlement had stamped itself cleanly onto the island, and everything after that was just repetition. But mitochondria rarely allow such neatness. They move only through mothers, and they keep their record with stubborn precision. So when the 27 samples each showed a different mtDNA sequence, The result did not erase the European picture already taking shape. It sharpened it. The maternal pool was not a flat copy of one lineage repeated over and over. It was a collection of separate women, separate households, separate arrivals, all carried forward through daughters who survived long enough to leave a trace. That detail matters, because diversity inside a dominant ancestry can reveal how settlement actually worked. A place can be overwhelmingly tied to one broad source and still be built from many smaller threads. In Newfoundland, the mitochondrial evidence suggests exactly that kind of interior complexity. The haplogroups are recognizably European, but no two sequences in the sample are the same. That means the maternal history preserved there was not the product of a single founding woman or one narrow family line. It was broader, more layered, and already mixed across several source women before it settled into the island's isolated communities. Isolation then did something else. It did not invent the ancestry, but it helped preserve it. Once these lines were established, distance and limited movement protected their shape. A lineage that might have been diluted elsewhere could remain legible here because people were not constantly replaced by newcomers. In that setting, a maternal signature could endure almost like a sealed message, passed down in silence while the outside world changed around it. And that is where the maternal evidence becomes more revealing than a simple label of European origin. It shows that the island's founders did not arrive as a single genetic unit. They carried different maternal histories into the same narrow geography, and those histories kept their own identities long enough to be read centuries later. The study does not make Newfoundland simpler. It makes the settlement look more human, women arriving at different moments, families folding into one another, lineages surviving in small pockets, each one carrying a fragment of a longer Atlantic journey. Once that is visible, a new question opens. If the maternal trail preserved so clearly on the island holds several European branches at once, what else was hidden inside the record that historical summaries never bothered to separate? In the Newfoundland samples, another signal surfaced in a place researchers often turn to when they want the paternal line stripped bare. The Y chromosome does not tell every story, but it tells a stubborn one. It follows fathers, sons, and the narrow routes through which surnames, land, and local memory can travel. And in a 2025 study archived on PubMed Central, that line refused to look simple. The paper reported 160 distinct Y haplogroups in Newfoundland and Labrador. That alone suggests a level of variety that would be hard to explain if the island had been shaped by a single founding wave. But the larger surprise sat inside the dominant branch. 71.4% belonged to R1b. In other words, the paternal landscape was not scattered into chaos. It was concentrated, coherent, and overwhelmingly tied to a pattern that mirrors populations in England and Ireland. The authors compared the composition with reference groups from those Atlantic homelands, and the resemblance was clear enough to strengthen the historical link rather than blur it. That matters, because the earlier maternal evidence had already hinted at a layered settlement, with women carrying different origins into the island's small communities. The Y chromosome picture does not cancel that complexity. It sharpens one side of it. It says the men who left descendants there were not an accidental assortment pulled from everywhere at once. They arrived through known Atlantic channels, and enough of their lineages stayed intact to be counted centuries later. Some surnames may have shifted, some families may have broken apart, but the paternal backbone remained recognizable. The number 160 is important for another reason. It shows that even inside a heavily R1b-dominated structure, Newfoundland and Labrador preserved a wide internal spread. That spread points to multiple male founders, repeated arrivals, and local branching after settlement. A community can look uniform in the broadest historical summary and still hide fine-grained diversity in its inherited markers. Here, the broad summary is not wrong. It is incomplete. The study from 2025, available through PMC 117.11138, gives that incompleteness a shape. It places the island's paternal heritage beside English and Irish patterns without reducing it to either one. The resemblance is close enough to confirm a North Atlantic source, but the count of distinct haplogroups shows how settlement continued to diversify after arrival. Isolation did not freeze history, it filtered it. Small communities kept certain male lines visible because movement was limited, marriage circles were local, and descendants often remained near the places where those lines first took hold. That is why the surprise is not just genetic, It is historical. A region often described through its remote geography turns out to preserve a record of repeated passage, local continuity, and careful inheritance. The chromosome passed from father to son becomes a map of endurance, showing which strands survived contact, distance, and time. And once that paternal map is placed beside the earlier maternal one, the shape of Newfoundland and Labrador changes again. What looked like a settled colonial origin now appears as a negotiated Atlantic identity, built from different arrivals that kept their marks instead of dissolving into anonymity. The island did not merely receive ancestors, it stored them. That is the point where the record becomes harder to dismiss, not because one lineage explains everything, but because several independent traces keep pointing in the same direction. The inheritance is older, denser, and more regional than any clean summary would allow. And if the Y chromosome can hold 160 distinct roots while still being dominated by one familiar Atlantic branch, what other hidden combinations have been sitting inside the archive, waiting for someone to count them properly? A second look at the archive changed the question entirely. In the 2023 PubMed study, researchers examining Newfoundland and Labrador found a pattern that seemed to pull in two directions at once: visible diversity in some sampled lineages, yet a broader genetic narrowing that pointed to a long history of founding and loss. The paper, published under PMID 371177635, tied that narrowing to a major demographic reduction about 10 to 15 generations ago, leaving a stronger signal of homozygosity than anyone would expect in a place so often described as open to the North Atlantic. That detail matters because it shifts the story away from a simple inventory of arrivals. The population is traced mainly to Irish and English immigrants who came in the 18th and 19th centuries, but the study did not stop at naming those movements. It showed that the descendants of those settlers lived through a population squeeze large enough to preserve only part of the original variation. Some family lines kept rare combinations. Others disappeared. What remained was not a flat genetic landscape, but a compressed one, where certain clusters stayed visible while the overall structure became tighter generation by generation. And that is where the contradiction becomes useful. The same territory can contain pockets of diversity without being genetically broad in the full sense. A small set of communities, isolated by coast, weather, and distance, may hold on to unusual haplotypes, while the larger provincial pattern reflects a founder effect. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the evidence suggests exactly that kind of split view. The local record can look intricate when a handful of descendants are sampled closely, but the deeper population story still carries the mark of a bottleneck that shaped inheritance across decades. What surprised the researchers was not simply that the modern profile was mixed. It was that the mix had a timestamp. The reduction did not belong to some remote prehistory. It sits within living memory of the genealogical record, close enough that surnames, parish ties, and settlement patterns still echo it. That means the genetic signature is not just an abstract outcome in a dataset. It is a record of households that stayed near one another, of marriage circles that repeated, of children born into a coast where the choices were narrow and the consequences durable. Seen that way, the island stops behaving like a single origin story and starts looking like a layered compression of Atlantic movement. Irish and English settlement gave it one framework. The later reduction made that framework more rigid. Then isolation preserved the cracks, the exceptions, the pockets where old combinations refused to vanish. The result is a population that can seem diverse under one lens and unexpectedly uniform under another, because both readings are true at once. If you want to understand why that matters, look at what homozygosity really means here. It is not a sterile statistic. It is the memory of a smaller gene pool surviving in a difficult place, where a few founding lines carried more weight than they would in a larger mainland population. In that sense, Newfoundland and Labrador preserve a human record of endurance under restriction, migration, settlement, contraction, and then the quiet work of inheritance holding on to whatever still fit. The deeper surprise is that this does not close the case. It opens one more. If a population shaped by 18th and 19th century arrivals can still carry such strong signs of reduction 10 to 15 generations later, then what else is hiding beneath the visible family tree? Which older connections survived in isolated communities, and which vanished before anyone thought to look? That is where the study leaves the ground unsettled again, because the answer is no longer just who came first. It is how much of the past a place like this can keep without ever announcing it. In the end, the most revealing part was not a single match in a family line or a neat origin story tied to one coast of Europe. It was the older ground beneath that story, the one that had been waiting in plain sight. When Memorial University of Newfoundland described genetic insights into the maritime archaic and Beothuk populations in 2017, it pointed to something far more layered than a simple colonial beginning. Newfoundland had been inhabited in different periods by distinct indigenous groups, including the maritime archaic and the Beothuk. That means the island was already carrying separate human histories before later settlers ever arrived to leave their own mark. That detail changes the whole shape of the question. The DNA is not only preserving the memory of migration from Ireland or England, it is also holding fragments of a much older North Atlantic human map, one formed by repeated presence, disappearance, and return. A place like Newfoundland never stood still long enough to become genetically simple. Different communities crossed it, lived through it, and in some cases vanished from the records while leaving traces in the biological record. The old assumptions fail because the archive was never only written on paper. What makes this more striking is how those traces survived. In isolated communities, rare ancestral signatures can persist for generations, not because history paused, but because geography narrowed the paths through which people met, married, and raised children. A harbor cut off by weather, a settlement reached by one road, a family line repeated in a small district. These are not dramatic scenes on a map, yet they decide what stays visible in the genome. In Newfoundland, isolation did not erase the past. It curated it. So the result is not just that the population is mixed, it is that the mixture is deep, older than expected, and unevenly preserved. Some layers came from documented European settlement. Some came from indigenous peoples, whose presence is now recovered through ancient DNA. Some survive as signatures of founder lines that became unusually strong in local communities. Together they form a record of adaptation to an island that demanded endurance from everyone who lived there, whether they came by choice, by necessity, or by inheritance. That is why the answer to Newfoundland's ancestry cannot be reduced to a single arrival date or a single ancestral label. The genetics point to a population built from several human worlds, each leaving a different kind of trace. The surprise is not merely that the past was complicated. It is that the complication was durable enough to survive into the present, hidden in plain genetic detail. And once that becomes visible, the island stops looking like a final chapter and starts looking like a crossing point. The bloodlines present today do not only reflect settlement, they reflect what settlement encountered, absorbed, and sometimes buried. The lines that remained were not the loudest ones. They were the ones that weathered distance, repetition, and time. That is the deeper ancestry the DNA exposed. Not a clean beginning, but a layered human persistence that still shapes Newfoundland now. By the time the archaeological layers and the genetic signals are placed side by side, the shape of Newfoundland changes again. A 2017 analysis at Memorial University of Newfoundland pointed to ancient DNA from different periods, showing traces associated with the maritime archaic and with the Beothuk. That detail matters because it breaks the old habit of imagining the island as if one people simply replaced another in a neat sequence. The record is messier than that. It holds separate human presences, separated by time, each leaving marks that still survive in the biological archive. And that is where the final picture becomes impossible to flatten. The island was not only settled by Europeans later on, it had already been occupied in more than one era by indigenous groups whose histories were not interchangeable. The maritime archaic present speaks to deep antiquity. The Beothuk record speaks to another chapter, later but still rooted in the island itself. Between those layers, and beneath the colonial census lines that came much later, the evidence keeps pointing to continuity, interruption, return, and loss. In other words, Newfoundland was never a blank shore waiting for history to begin. What the genetics ultimately exposed is not just ancestry, but memory under pressure. Isolation did not erase the past. It preserved pieces of it. Small communities held onto uncommon traces because distance made change slower, not simpler. Founder lines remained visible. Older mixtures stayed readable. And the island, instead of revealing a single origin story, became a record of repeated human contact across centuries and across worlds on the North Atlantic rim. That is why Newfoundland now stands as more than a case study. It is a reminder that identity can be built from arrivals that never fully disappear, from populations that overlap without becoming the same, from histories preserved in places where the sea both protected and separated. The result is a population with roots deeper and wider than the familiar story suggested, shaped by indigenous presence, European settlement, and the long discipline of survival in a demanding place. If you want to understand Newfoundland, you cannot stop at the first recorded landing or the most convenient label. You have to follow the deeper layers, the ones Memorial University helped bring back into view in 2017, and accept that the island's ancestry was assembled over time, not delivered in a single wave. That is the revelation the DNA leaves behind. Newfoundland is not a simple endpoint of migration. It is a living overlap of histories, still present in the people who carry them. If you found this genetic deep dive fascinating, hit that subscribe button to join our journey through the human code. And let me know in the comments, what do you think is the biggest secret hidden in your own ancestry? Thanks for watching.